Hi, Cora Stack here again, Dr. Stack. I've been asked to do a video about this for a long time, and there's a lot of people that I know that have suffered under this miscategorization, and it's in my opinion it's a blind spot in employment law, which to date has not been recognised by the Irish courts and perhaps elsewhere. I'm sure that it's the case elsewhere as well. So let me explain it, because I think mathematics is a very good way of looking at it in terms of continuous time and discrete time, and the huge difference that would make if we were to map these two continuous systems. It's like the analog, in engineering, the digital analog, and in mathematics would be continuous versus discrete, and then how discrete can almost be, measure zero, just got rid of sort of thing, case no case to answer. So the title of this video is Why Democratic Systems Protect Abusers in Plain Sight. Now, people would say there's abuse everywhere, abuse of power, and that it's shocking the amount of abuse that's in Ireland today, that it's absolutely shocking. We hear about, abuse and institutional abuse. We hear about abuse of women. We hear about domestic violence, coercive control. We hear about workplace bullying and so on, and coercion everywhere, and domineering behaviour. But let me try and differentiate, that's a great word in mathematics, between a discrete system that describes abuse in a discrete time system versus a continuous time system, and to say that continuous abuse is unrecognised in employment law. Okay? So, and it's very cleverly reframed as discrete, and then no case to answer. So again, why democratic systems protect abusers in plain sight. So democracies love to say no one is above the law. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Abuse of authority can happen in plain sight, and the system can still produce the same final sentence every time. No case to answer, a case dismissed, or etc. So not because the abuse didn't happen, but because democratic systems have learned, unfortunately, this is democratic decay, in my opinion, the exponential decay, sadly, because not because democratic systems have learned, not because the abuse didn't happen, but because democratic systems have learned how to neutralise it without appearing to. You see, it's really clever. Very, very clever. So let's think of coercive control. We all have an idea of what that is. Let me put it in a mathematical term, what that would mean, and then how that gets reframed into bullying, and then that gets reframed into no case to answer, case dismissed, or there is no case to answer, and case thrown out. So in this video, I'm going to show you the pipeline democratic institutions sometimes are often used to make abuse disappear, very sadly, especially when the abuse comes from inside their own hierarchies. And this is very common. I mean, we see it at the start of strategies. Every big tribunal, there's a huge amount of tribunals about abuse, and it's shocking, really. Millions spent on solicitors and lawyers, and very little in the end left to correct the issues or the systemic issues which caused the abuse, or even to give proper compensation to the abused people. It's shocking, really, with the way things are done. But anyway, pattern domination, that's what I'm talking about now. Interestingly, the Prime Minister of France today has come out and said France prefers respect to bullies. So I wonder, does that apply to Ireland? Pattern domination is reframed as bullying, conflict, or communication difficulty. There's a big difference between pattern domination, as we'll see in a minute, and bullying or conflict or communication breakdowns or difficulties. That reframing strips out power, intent, and passion, the very core of coercive behaviours or coercive control, inverted commas. Then the institution runs a familiar process that ends in administrative closure. Not substantiated, insufficient evidence, insufficient corroboration, no breach, no case to answer. And the institution keeps its reputation intact while the harmed person exits carrying both the original injury and what I often refer to in a lot of my research, institutional betrayal. Why this happens in democracies, not despite them. This is not an accident, it is an architecture. This is not mainly about a few bad apples, it's about systems designed to protect legitimacy, manage risk, and contain liability. Is this in the interest of democracy? Democracy depends on institutions, courts, regulators, educational systems, schools, universities, health systems, public bodies to maintain order and trust. And that creates a problem. When the abuse comes from within these institutions, recognising it threatens the system's credibility. So the system often chooses a safer outcome. Acknowledge harm in language, but deny it in consequence, or we often hear closing the ranks. The core mechanism, the category swap, the switch that kills accountability. Here's the move that starts everything. You present, inverted commas, coercive control, a pattern strategy of domination. So that's why I'm defining it now. Coercive control is a patterned strategy of domination. This system then relabels it as bullying. That sounds validating, but it's not. Because coercive control, in other words, in my definition, a patterned strategy of domination is not a list of bad moments. It's a structure of power over time. So it's a continuum of bad behaviour, not isolated incidents. It's a continuum, it's a pattern of domination, it's a structure of power over time. Intimidation, reputational sabotage, smear campaigns, isolation, procedural traps, entrapment traps, obstruction of resistance, use of legitimate processes as weapons. Bullying frameworks don't see that. They typically break harm into isolated incidents rather than pattern domination, presume symmetry between parties, treat it as interpersonal friction, emphasise informal resolution, avoid naming authority abuse. So when coercive control, so I'm calling coercive control a patterned strategy of domination, and it's a structure of power over time. So bullying frameworks don't see this. They typically break harm into incidences, presume symmetry between parties, treat it as interpersonal friction, or emphasise informal resolution. Avoid naming authority abuse. So when coercive control, as defined as a pattern of continuous domination, is renamed as bullying, the case becomes legally and administrative unrecognisable. The outcome is now predictable. The no case to answer machine, how the system manufactures failure. Step 1, procedure replaces justice. The focus shifts from what has been done to this person over time to where procedures followed. Procedure becomes the institution's shield. If the forms were completed, the meetings were held, the policy was referenced, the institution can claim fairness while avoiding truth. Stage 2, pattern incidents. Pattern is atomized into isolated incidents. So the domination, the continuous pattern of domination now is discretized. You describe a pattern, they demand a list. Then each item is dismissed as not severe enough, open to interpretation, uncorroborated. That's a great word, that's used repeatedly, uncorroborated. Explain distress management style, miscommunication. That's all minimization. This is the most important point. Coercive control collapses when you fragment it. Its harm is cumulative, so instant-based analysis becomes a tool of erasure. Burdens of proof quietly escalate. At first you're told, document everything. Then your documentation becomes evidence that you're completely obsessive. You're asked to produce contemporaneous corroboration for long-term harm. Proof of intent. Perfect consistency across years of stress. Emotional control under adversarial conditions. And here is the asymmetry, something I talk about a lot in my research. Authoritative figures have credibility by default. The complainant has to earn it, which is putting more burden reversal. That's another point that I issue that I discussed in a lot of my research, because a lot of my research are about understanding abuse dynamics. So credibility reversal. Your credibility then becomes the target. So next thing, you're the fault. Your credibility is questioned. So it all goes from a particular case where you're saying that the institution has subjected you to this pattern, domination, pattern, coercive control, down to your credibility becomes the target. At this point, the case stops being about the perpetrator's conduct and becomes about your unreasonableness. Distress becomes instability, anger becomes aggression, fear becomes paranoia, and persistence becomes abuse of power or vexatious. This is what is known. This is known institutional pattern. When they can't disprove the harm, they discredit the human being reporting it. Now, this is not in all cases. There are genuinely people who are vexatious, but this seems to go on a huge amount in personal injury cases which are reduced to bullying or indeed struck out as not being anything at all. So, that last particular case. So there's a huge amount of reframing, and it's because the pattern of domination is reduced to isolated incidents, and then the isolated incidents, at best you'll get is bullying, which really is nothing, is considered nothing. But the pattern domination of domination over time has never been challenged in the Irish higher courts, as I understand it. So therefore, that is a blind spot in Irish employment law, because most of the employers, the big money goes to protect employers rather than employees. So very few solicitors will take on an institution, very few. So there's access to justice again, hugely. Closure without accountability. Now the institution can close the case with seemingly neutral language, insufficient evidence, not substantiated, no breach, no case to answer. And it all sounds objective, but it is often the end point of a process that was structurally designed to make a pattern impossible to prove. The clinical turn, how support unfortunately becomes a silencing technology. When power becomes your mental health, then comes one of the most devastating pivots in democratic systems, the clinical turn. Psychology, psychiatry, and occupational health are introduced as inverted commas support. But in institutional settings, they often function as gatekeeping mechanisms that shift the narrative from power to pathology. Let me say that again. Psychology, psychiatry, and occupational health are introduced as support, but in institutional settings, they often function as gatekeeping mechanisms that shift the narrative from power to pathology. The question changes from what is being done to you to what is wrong with you. Distress becomes anxiety, depression, adjustment disorder, burnout. These labels may describe symptoms very accurately, but they often erase etiology, the cause, which is very important if you want to get any sense of justice here. Meanwhile, the powerful actors are rarely clinically examined. High-functioning dominance is mistaken for stability. Impression management is mistaken for mental health. This produces what I call causation inversion. Your injury becomes your fault, your flaw, and the perpetrator's strategy disappears from the record. Once the record omits causation, the case can be closed neutrally. Why democracies especially protect authority abuse? Why does this happen so consistently in democracies? It's a huge question, huge, because democratic institutions have unfortunately competing priorities. They must appear fair, they must maintain legitimacy. Very importantly, they must manage institutional risk, or they have become that way, that they're almost obsessed with managing institutional risk. They must contain liability and compensation exposure. They must preserve hierarchy and government stability. That's what they feel they have to be doing. This is like the unhidden kind of laws behind democracy. They must appear fair. They must maintain legitimacy. They must manage reputational risk. These are all the hidden kind of laws. They must contain liability and compensation exposure. Would you consider that? democracy? They must preserve hierarchy and governance stability. Is that real democracy? So instead of confronting abuse of authority directly, many systems choose an alternative solution. They reframe the harm, run a process, close the case, protect the institution's narrative of neutrality. This is what makes it in plain sight. You can watch the system acknowledge harm and simultaneously ensure it produces no consequences. Where this shows up, it's not just workplaces. The pipeline appears wherever there is power asymmetry. This is what I write a lot about. I write a huge amount about power asymmetry and how it can be very hidden. A conflict of interest is huge in all of this. Dependency, procedural control, and in particular, weak external oversight. That includes workplaces, grievances loops, performance management weaponized, higher education collegiately used as discipline, reputational economics, economies, healthcare, hierarchy, silence culture, professional capture, unions and professional bodies, conflict of interest, risk aversion, courts and policing, incident-based thresholds, deference to authority, litigants in person penalised, regulators' reliance on internal records, procedural closure, different uniforms, same machine. The bottom line, no case to answer isn't neutral. No case to answer is often not a finding of truth. Sadly, it's an engineered, evidential outcome produced by incident-based reasoning that dissolves pattern, as I said already. Incidence-based, so the time dimension, the domination over time gets fragmented, and so the coercive control gets reframed into credibility reversal that pathologizes complainants, diagnostic suppression that erases causation, attrition and delay that exhaust resistance, legal thresholds calibrated to contain liability. So what disappears is not harm. What disappears is the system's ability or willingness to recognize harm as abuse of authority. What should real accountability look like? Move from incidents to patterns, longitudinal evidence, power mapping. Restore causation in clinical and institutional assessment. Create independent oversight where institutions cannot investigate themselves or have investigations farmed out to organisations where there is conflict of interest. Reject false neutrality in context of extreme power imbalance, because neutrality in unequal conditions is absolutely not neutrality. It is alignment with power. Closing. If you've lived this pattern, and I have met many who have, you'll recognise it instantly. Harm acknowledged, power protected, complainant discredited, case closed. Democracy is not proven by slogans. It is proven by whether institutions can confront abuse inside their own walls. If you want more on this framework, coercive control beyond the domestic sphere, institutional betrayal, and why bullying often functions as containment, follow this work. And I have a paper on this on academia.edu, and it's called From Coercion to Bullying to No Case at All.